those of you who may be confused, this is Conflict Micro 1. No one's going to be offended if you stand up and leave now. But welcome to Conflict Micro 1. We have an exciting lineup. Our first paper is going to be Roxana Gutierrez Romero talking about an inquiry into the use of legal electoral practices and effects of political violence. And my name is Justin Sandifer, and I will be chair and discussant for Roxana. So our format is 15 minutes presentation, 4 for discussion, and then 10 minutes open to the floor for Q&A. So hold your questions to the end. Thank you.
Hello, can you hear me? Yeah, good. Good afternoon. In this article, I set to analyze 2 questions. Oh, it works here. Good, it's working now. Sorry. First of all, whether the violence that Kenya witnessed in the 2007 elections was strategically motivated. And second of all, whether having experienced violence affected people's perceptions on key issues, such as the role of ethnopolitics in Kenya. And as you might remember, the 2007 Kenyan elections were competitive. People once again turned up to vote in large numbers, and the apparent peaceful elections suddenly changed once the electoral results were announced. Violence erupted across the country, 1,200 people died, over 500,000 people got displaced in the weeks of the onset of the conflict, and the conflict only ended when a coalition government was agreed. And although some of the violence appeared to have appeared spontaneously, there are concerns that the violence was orchestrated by political actors. So in order to study these questions, I analyzed basically 2 data sets. First, a survey that the CSAE conducted 2 weeks before the 2007 elections, which then interviewed respondents on the summer of 2008. And these surveys are nationally representative. Then I also wanted to look at the dynamic picture of where violence occurred and how quickly it spread to areas. So to assess that, I also monitored major media houses in Kenya, such as TV, local radio stations, and newspapers. So the incidence of violence from these reports tally very, very well to the incidence of violence estimated by Independent Commission in Kenya. So let me provide you with a snapshot of what I found in this data. The surveys reveal that the same as other opinion polls conducted around the same time of elections. The ODM party, the opposition party, had a slim majority of votes in favor, in contrast to the opposition party, the PNU, which was backing the re-election bid of Mwai Kibaki. And the electorate was clearly divided between these 2 parties along ethnic lines. Also, the survey revealed a number of irregularities. 1 in 10 respondents claimed that they were threatened by a political party, and the threats came either from the PNU or the ODM party. A third of the respondents claimed that political actors were instigating people to be violent in their communities before the elections, and this figure remained unchanged after the elections. 23% of the respondents claimed to have heard gangs connected to political parties acting in their communities before the election, and this figure went up to 30% after the election. Mungiki was the gang that was mostly mentioned according to the survey respondents, and this gang was allegedly linked to the PNU party and had alleged links to the recently elected president in Kenya. According to the post-electoral survey, 20% of the respondents claim to have suffered a personal impact from the violence, either in personal injuries, damage to their property, or even displacement. And I show you here the number of casualties reported around the election times. Before the elections, I estimated 41 people were killed. Most of them occurred during political rallies and in 2 areas which have a long history of political violence around elections. Soon after the electoral results were announced, violence erupted across the country, spreading to areas that typically have experienced violence before, but also affecting areas that didn't have violence before. So given this complex picture, I asked whether we can find evidence that political parties behave strategically instigating violence with the data we collected. And do we have a number of theoretical models in the literature suggesting when political parties are more likely to use vote buying, instigate violence, or even try to rig the elections? I look at all these strategies in the paper, but due to time limitation, I will only present here what I found for the violence aspect. So I studied the surveys I collected, and I run a number of probit models where I test what the theoretical literature is telling me. So I'm going to present you here the results. In the first 2 columns, I found that the areas that have the most closely contested presidential elections also reported that the politician instigating violence with more frequency there. And I measured the degree of how closely contested the elections were in these areas based on my pre-electoral survey, not on the official electoral results. And I believe that probably political parties were instigating violence in this area because they used violence as a measure of damage control. They wanted the rival supporters not to turn up to vote. And this is perhaps clear in the third and fourth column. There I show that exactly the same areas that had experienced a closely contested elections also were more likely to claim that the PNU or the ODM party was instigating direct threats. And these parties instigated violence in areas where they had an advantage as well, and in these areas were selecting specific groups. For instance, the ODM was less likely to threaten members of the ethnic groups who were supporting the party, and the PNU was less likely to threaten people from the Kisi group that, according to the data, was a group that the PNU was trying to lure with vote buying. Also, I found that the PNU was more likely to issue direct threats to areas where the supporters of the ODM predominantly lived. And in the last 2 columns, I showed that specific groups were targeted by organized gangs with alleged links to political parties. And that was the case, for instance, of the Luyas. There's too far away to show you. And this group reported organized gangs operating in their communities before and also after the elections. And we must remember that the Luyas were supporters of the ODM. And I think this is a finding that is consistent with a theoretical model by Paul Collier and Pedro Vicente. And they argue that when the opposition party has a large support base, then the incumbent party will try to intimidate the challengers' moderate voters for them not to vote. So now I turn my attention to the second question, whether to have been affected by violence at personal level change the perception of the victims of violence. And I measure this using a difference in difference estimator. So this estimator helps me to isolate the effect of violence. Here I compare the change in perceptions of the victims of violence to the change of perceptions that the non-victims of violence had. And in order to compare similar people, I use propensity score matching, such that I compare people who were victims and not victims of violence, but who had the same age, education, ethnicity, and same history of experienced political violence in the past. Using this estimator, I did not find changes across a number of issues. For instance, the support for democracy remained high across both groups. The belief that political competition in Kenya remained high as well, and I didn't find any difference between victims and not victims. Also, there are high levels of fear to be victimized during elections, and that fear did not change after the disputed elections. However, I found some interesting differences between these two groups, which I show here. In the first column, I found that the victims of violence, despite of the ordeal, are more likely to support the use of elections in order to select their leaders. In the second column, I show that because of the violence, those directly affected now believe that political parties should not be allowed to be organized on ethnic basis. However, people, regardless whether they were victims or non-victims, still judge which political party they should support on the basis of the ethnicity of their political leader. And there is evidence in African countries that right before the elections, the ethnicity identity is strengthened because political parties mobilize voters on that basis in order to have access to land and power. What I found here in the fourth and fifth column is that ethnic identity wasn't strengthened among the victims of violence, and also the use of violence in order to resolve conflict increased among the victims of violence. So in sum, I believe that there is evidence that some of the violence erupted opportunistically, but also I think there is evidence that political parties instigated strategically and even before the elections. Kenya had recently an election that was a big test for the country and for the rule of law that was badly damaged in the last election. And I believe that the peaceful outcome that we witnessed is the result of the several reforms that were put in place. But also because Kenyans look at the brink in the previous elections and they didn't like what they saw. However, I think there are several issues pending. Given this complex context that they have, I think what is happening is that the political system is still vulnerable to ethnic polarization. Judging from the surveys I presented, people do not want political parties to be organized on ethnic basis, but because the parties organized on that basis, citizens are forced to judge which party I should vote to on the basis of ethnicity alone. So how can we make sure that Kenya remains a peaceful, democratic country in the long run? And I think there's an option to continue strengthening institutions and also to ensure that every Kenyan, regardless of ethnic origin, has an equal access to political and economic resources. Apart from these important aspects, I think it's very relevant to address the past grievances, land disputes, and the fact that today many people are still displaced because they are too afraid to go back. And to conclude, a few people will stand trial at the ICC. We will have to wait if the victims of this violence will ever get justice. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Roxana. I don't have slides, so let me read off my laptop here as discussant. So, a really interesting question, really interesting data source here with electoral polling data on a panel of individuals, on a panel of potential voters before and after an election in which, as we know, there was widespread violence. The paper is divided into these two halves. The first half about the strategic behavior of political parties, trying to look at theoretical models that can predict where vote buying and where the incitement to violence will occur from a strategic point of view. And the second part of the paper saying, basically, in a diff and diff framework, can we look at the treatment effect of political violence? What does political violence do to people's norms and attitudes? So brief comments on each of those two halves, and then a thought about how they could be better tied together. On the strategic behavior of the political parties, you march through some various theoretical frameworks and kind of land, I think, on this Collier and Vicente model. It's not entirely clear in the write-up of the paper if you're really going to commit to testing this model, which I think is where the paper is going and I think is an interesting direction. But if so, I mean, the Collier and Vicente model seems to have relatively few dimensions, right? It's about there are two instruments. There is vote buying and there is intimidation. There is how close, the predicted win margin, and there's whether you are the incumbent party or the non-incumbent party, or the party predicted to win or not. And instead in the table, I felt like there were many, many dimensions in the table, some of which conceptually reduced to those dimensions, but I was having a hard time, even knowing something about Kenyan elections, mapping all of those ethnic dummies onto these theoretical predictions. So tightening up how exactly are you testing the Collier and Vicente model would be nice, but I like that direction for it. The changes in the perceptions before and after, this is where I think it gets a little weird, and the data say what the data say, so, and there are basically mixed results in the table. You find some, the signs are going in different directions, and that's what, when I was reading the paper and I got to the end and the last paragraphs of the conclusions, it was pitched as a focus on alienation and reduced political participation, a comparison to the Central American experience, suggesting that violence is going to backfire on the perpetrators and so on. When there is another literature, an African literature, Chris Blattman's stuff in Uganda, Bellows and Miguel in Sierra Leone, kind of saying that these sort of ironic, unexpected results that maybe political participation and norms improve in some sense for the victims of this violence afterward. And if you read tables 8 and 9 of your paper, there's plenty of significant point estimates there that point in the same direction as the Bellows and Miguel and the Blattman story. So you've got people who've experienced violence being more likely to say they shouldn't give up on elections, we shouldn't abolish the Electoral Commission and empower the president, they're saying we shouldn't have ethnic parties, and they claim they don't consider ethnicity in the voting. So they're saying all of these quote-unquote good things as a result, if we believe the diff and diff PSM thing, as a result of the ethnic violence. But then there are other point estimates that point in the other direction. They're more likely to identify ethnically, support violence for a certain cause, and to distrust the police. It seemed to me that you were cherry-picking a little bit on the bad news there, when if I was just to count coefficients, the good news was kind of winning those tables. The last part, I guess, my last comment would be about how to tie these things together, because right now, they're kind of two completely distinct things that your data can do, and you've done both of them. I'm wondering, and maybe this is too ambitious or quirky, but we've had another election in Kenya. There wasn't mass violence. If you were to put this the other way around, if you were to take some of the more good news stories from the effects of political violence, it seems like there's a story there about the impact section saying that violence changes political preferences, making people more suspicious of these calls to ethnic violence. If you used the same variables that you're using in the impact section and put them into your model of predicting when violence happens, I'm wondering if you could build a model of basically cycles of electoral violence. That electoral violence in one cycle is going to change people's norms and change their receptivity to these messages in the future. Start to build a story of what certainly the media story has been that the receptivity to these messages has gone down in Kenya, and you seem to have all the ingredients to be able to build that model. All right, but otherwise, lots of entertaining stuff and stuff to chew on in the paper. Thank you. Maybe, I don't know if you want to come back up and be the one to, rather than playing intermediary, if you want to field questions, I think we're open for.
Shall I answer your comments first? Sure. Yeah. Thank you very much, Justin, for your comments. I really take on board that I should tidy up the presentation of testing the hypothesis derived from Paul, Collier, and Pedro Vicente. I'm actually heading towards that direction. And I also really liked your suggestion of drawing a theoretical model looking at the dynamics of elections. And I think that's probably what I was thinking already, that my models predicted that this one will have violence, this election will have violence, and we didn't see it. But what is going to happen in the future, given that we didn't experience violence now? So most of the theoretical literature doesn't focus on a dynamic election system. Everything is static. So drawing a theoretical model on that base, I think, will be a contribution to the literature. Okay, so I now can take questions. Yeah.
I would be interested to know more about how you measure political violence. So, as I understood, it's based on media sources. At least this is one of the sources. So I'm a bit concerned that media also have incentives to report more on political violence if the gap is smaller. This is basically what you find. That there's more political violence if the majority gap is smaller, but I would also expect that media report more violence.
That's a good question. That was my very first concern when I first looking at these issues in 2008. We didn't have any estimates of violence then. So one suggestion was to look at the media. And of course, you're right. We don't know if the media is right. We don't know if the acts were verified. And when we finished cleaning the data, we were very surprised that our estimates of the number of casualties remarked almost entirely to the ones estimated independently by a commission in Kenya. And the methods we used were completely different. I just look at the media, and they look at the autopsies and reports by police and so on. So in terms of casualties, the numbers is precisely right. In terms of number of injuries and number of political violence, I don't trust the media sources at all. I just trust the casualties because I know that other people have found exactly the same numbers. So what the data presented here is based on survey respondents, whether they say, I was victim of violence, personal violence in terms of personal injury, displacement, or damage to property. So I use different sources in order to estimate the impact of violence. Yeah?
So I had 3 quick comments. One related to media, which is just, I was wondering about control of media. So would they be reporting bias by different sources of media depending on what political party, for example, they're affiliated with or unincentives? Is there some way you can control for sources when you're reporting results? The second was about attrition. This is a little bit of insider knowledge, but I know that there was high attrition in this, and I haven't done papers, so I was just wondering if you managed to control effectively for attrition bias. And the third was, of course, Kenya just went to the polls, and I feel that it would be really nice to get a sense of, certainly it's early days, but get a sense of, at least in the build-up towards the Kenyan elections and perhaps in the outcomes, where it seems that there was a different level of competition, and there was, and the elections went kind of the other way, and so on. Is there some way that you can pitch this in the context of the more of the recent elections? What would maybe be your thoughts on that?
Thank you very much. I think I was very concerned that they will be biased in the media sources. And especially because when we look at the radio stations and TV stations, some of the houses were exactly the same. And we were concerned that will be overrepresented, for instance, the number of deaths and so on. That's why we decided to look at across different types of media, newspapers, radio, local radio stations and TV stations. And we cannot perceive any bias as such, at least in the very things that we look at. We didn't look comprehensively at every single newspaper, every single TV station. We were selective. And it took us 2 years to clean the data. So it's extremely painful to do this kind of analysis and to conclude that, yes, we found out the same number of casualties as other people have found in a less painful way. So that's why I didn't exploit as such that database. But I do use in my analysis just to identify which areas were the ones who were reporting violence. And the survey matches very well with the media. Where my survey respondents are telling me, I suffer violence here, the media also picks that effect as well. And in terms of attrition, yes, we have a very large attrition, 40%. A number of things explained this. There was displacement, so we couldn't find out where our respondents were at the end. And when we went to the field, we never anticipated that we would experience violence, so we were not ready to follow up respondents. That was a problem, and what we did on the field is to control for attrition. When we went to the field, we knew in advance that we would have a very large attrition rate because we did piloting and we couldn't find lots of people. So therefore, we replaced respondents such that they have the same characteristics, the same ethnicity, and so on. And with the panel, the pseudo panel I had, that's what I presented. And I estimated what I had, only focused on the people I managed to follow over time. And I found exactly the same thing. And I used also some instrumental variables in order to control for the attrition I'm observing. Some people I'm not observing probably because they got displaced or because they were affected by violence. And I found exactly the same story, which just in saying maybe I didn't cherry pick everything I like. This is what I found in the entire data. I really studied comprehensively. And to be honest, I was surprised by the peaceful outcome that Kenya had. And I was happy of what we witnessed. But at the same time, I was concerned that we had a repeat of the past. Kenya is still dividing on ethnic lines. People are still choosing their candidates on the basis of ethnicity. And we must remember that I must be critical with my data is that the responses I'm hearing is sometimes the responses that people would like to give, the polite version. So probably that's the confusion message my data is suggesting. People don't really know that it's bad to select political leaders on that basis, but they do it anyway. So we need to find a way to break that vicious circle. That's what Justin is telling me. If we analyze this on a dynamic basis, we'll have peace and then violence, peace and then violence, and that's exactly what we as economists need to address and policymakers need to change. More questions? Thank you.
Take that off. So did you hear me? Okay. Does this work, or can you hear me? Okay. Okay, so this is a very different kind of paper. It's only theory until now. Well, titled State Strength, Outside Interventions, and the Intensity of Conflict, and it's joint work with Erwin Bote from Wageningen and Tilburg University. Okay, so since I don't have much time, I will give you in a nutshell what I would like you to take away from this talk. First, what I will do is, or we will do, I'll present the theoretical model of two groups. I guess you all know this kind of models. So we have the ruler and the rebels, I will call these two groups, and they fight over a distribution of exogenous windfall rents. Then I will evaluate the effect of third-party interventions, who has the aim of affecting conflict outcome. Considered interventions will be changes in the value of the rent, effort costs, effectiveness in conflict, as well as the ruler's time horizon. Why that is important, I will come back to later. Now, that will be the main message. The main message is policies are not one size fits all. What does that mean? Basically, at the moment, maybe you don't really understand what I mean with that, but what I will tell you is that the effect of policies, of these kind of interventions, will depend on military strength, state strength, and their interplay. Do I have a laser pointer on this? Yeah, okay. Okay, I don't need to introduce the topic very much here, I guess, just very quickly. So after 1945, majority of conflicts are intrastate, majority of those are taking place in developing countries, and we see a rise in incidence and duration. So this is an important topic that we should think about. Consequence, obviously, human misery, but also economic setback and international spillovers. Two things that are important for our modeling is very often these are distributive conflicts over rents, so that's something we will take into account. We'll look at distributive conflicts and economic factors at least determine viability. Okay, there's this great discussion, greed versus grievance, but at least we know that economic factors do play a role. Now, of course, the next question will be what can be done, and does third-party intervention make sense? So that's what we will focus on. Potential interventions we will look at will be, I will talk about that in a second, so basically the probability to stay in power, and focusing on military strength, the valuation of the price, so that would be something like a trade embargo like we saw in the Kimberley process. Conflict effort costs, where you could think about an arms trade ban or effect opportunity costs, so that would be more development interventions where we say we increase the opportunity cost of potential rebels, or the ability efficiency in the battlefield, so transfer of military technology. And we will look at this, all of these things that can be basically changed asymmetrically, so just changed for one group and not for the other. Okay, so what is state strength in our idea? I guess you all know that there are different complementary definitions. One would be the most common definition, maybe also used by Acemoglu, which proxies the ability or capacity of states to act within a certain setup. But that's not the definition we will focus on. We will actually take this one. So what Pranabaran suggested is that a strong state or a state strength somehow proxies the ability to credibly pre-commit by a ruler or by a state. Okay? So he says that a strong ruler can be thought of as Zuckerberg leader in a model where the ruler maximizes his objective function subject to the reaction of the rule. So that's basically just a definition of a Zuckerberg leader in a theoretical conflict game. So in that sense, a strong ruler would be a leader in a Zuckerberg setup, and the state can actually influence the actions of the rebels, whereas a weak ruler would simply be one of the two symmetric no players where the state cannot influence the actions. Okay. The setup is like this. So basically, we will have an environment, and that will be given by exogenous parameters, so that could be the price, effort costs, etc. And potential third-party intervention. So the third party can somehow potentially influence that environment. And then we will have an indefinitely repeated conflict game, so we don't know when it ends, between the ruler and the rebels. Okay? Okay, so let's have a quick look at the stage game. So that game which is repeated indefinitely. We have two groups, rulers and rebels. This is very standard. So they choose their effort levels such as to maximize their income, their expected outcome of the conflict, which basically, let me show you this, basically is just the probability to get the price. So that is the price they set. That's the probability, which is basically given by effective effort divided by the sum of effective efforts minus the cost of effort. Okay, so that's the unit cost, and that will be the effort. The X will be the effort of the group. I will call the ruler R and the rebels E. Okay, so basically what you will see is that there are two dimensions worth distinguishing. One, I already talked about that. So either we play in a Cournot setup or we play in a Zuckerberg setup. So either we have a weak state or we have a strong state. The other one that you will see is important, or turns out to be important, is what I call military strength. You could also call this cost effectiveness or cost benefit ratio. Okay? So basically we will have a favorite state, a state which actually has very high motivation to fight, so that would be his price here, very high price, very low effort costs, okay, compared to the rebels. That would be the favorite state, and why do we call this a favorite state? This is according to Dixit. Basically, he will win with a higher probability. He will exert more effort, and he will win with a higher probability. Okay, on the other hand, we'll have, well, exactly the other case where the rebels are the ones that have the higher motivation, higher military strength. That will be the underdog state. Okay, so let's have a quick look at the outcome of the state game. So let's say we have the state as the underdog. So here the state or the ruler is disadvantaged, so they have a relatively low price, relatively high costs. What do we see here? We see that basically, okay, just look at the graph here. Okay, so it's always the case that the rebels are somehow stronger, fighting more than the ruler, no matter in which setup we play. But comparing the setups, so comparing a strong versus a weak ruler, we find that there's less conflict if the ruler is strong. Why is that? Because here the ruler is weak, So here, rebels are ready to fight somehow. So whenever the ruler goes forth, the rebels go forth as well. And what we see is that a strong ruler realizes that, economizes on effort costs, and then both parties fight less. Okay? Now, the story is different if the state is the favorite. If the state is the favorite, he's advantaged, so he has low costs, high price valuation. What he realizes that actually he can repress the rebels, he can push them back by putting forth more effort. So once he can do that, once he's a strong state, he will do that. So that's what we see here. So he will put forth more effort. The rebels will simply be repressed, and we have an ambiguous outcome on total conflict, and this would be what I would call the repressive state. Okay? So that will be the stage game that is repeated. Now, next question, of course, is who is a strong state? So who is a strong state in our setup? I will do that very shortly, because that's very standard for infinitely repeated games. So we have no commitment device. It turns out that a ruler that wants to be perceived as strong in the future, so that has a wide time horizon, needs to stick to his Zuckerberg strategy, and the incentive to do so depends on his regard for future income. So basically, if he wants to be perceived as strong in the future, he will have to act strong today, and if he wants to do that or not depends on his regard for whether he will be there in the future or not. Now, the interesting thing is that, so we do that endogenously in the model, and it actually depends on model parameters. Okay, so what you see here, this A here, so if you go here to the right, the military strength of the ruler increases. So his price increases, his costs decrease. And what we see, so this is the critical discount factor. So a ruler that is credibly strong has a rather high discount factor. Yeah? So if this is the actual discount factor, we have basically 4 sectors. So we have this sector where we have a weak underdog, so militarily and a weak ruler that is militarily weak. Okay. Then here, the discount factor is such that we have a strong underdog. So we have a ruler that wants to behave strong but still is militarily weak. Then here we have a strong favorite, and here we have a weak favorite. So here again, so this is not monotonous, because the incentives to deviate, to actually not play Zuckerberg, are very strong if the contest is uneven. Okay, so ruler is likely to be weak whenever the conflict or the contest is very uneven. Okay. Okay, so now we know basically the outcome of the game. Let's look at third-party interventions. So what could be objectives of a third party? I will not talk about all of these, just to give you an idea of what we thought about. So it could just basically want to reduce resources wasted in conflict. So that would be just the sum of the conflict efforts. It could want to reduce open conflict intensity. Since one cannot fight alone, we could define it as the minimum of the conflict efforts. Or it could simply want to affect the distribution of expected conflict gains. So it might just want to help one party and not the other one. Now, what could a third party do? I basically look at 2 different kinds of interventions. One is what I call a non-marginal intervention. So basically, we jump, in that picture that I just showed you, of the 4 sectors, we jump from one sector to the other sector. So what we could do is we could affect the ruler's regard for the future. Okay, let's simply look at that for a second. Now, that would have different effects depending on which kind of ruler we're facing. If we would if we would have an underdog state, so a relatively weak state, and we increase his probability to stay in power, basically we make a strong state out of a weak state. Yeah. The ruler becomes strong. What's the effect? Less resources are wasted in conflict. Conflict intensity decreases. Distribution is ambiguous. Okay, so but basically we get what we want if we assume third party wants to reduce conflict efforts, for example. But if we increase a favorite's probability to stay in power, that could be exactly the other way. So the ruler becomes strong, a weak favorite state becomes strong. What do we see? We see an ambiguous effect on resources wasted. We do see that conflict intensity decreases because this is basically this repressive state. Okay, so we make a weak state strong, he's repressive, conflict intensity decreases. Distribution tilts towards the ruler. Okay, so this is what I would call we change the rules of the game. Now I could also look at marginal interventions. So I could basically just look at what happens if we affect the prices or the costs of any party. Yeah? So what happens, just to give you a general picture, I'm not going to talk about the effectiveness parameter here. What happens if we decrease the price for the rebels, let's say, okay? So first thing that happens is what we expect. The rebels decrease their effort, that's what we would like, but this is not the whole story because there is also strategic interaction. So the ruler might increase or decrease his effort, okay? And that might have different effects. I will just come back to that in a second. The same thing if we help the rebels by decreasing the price of the ruler. So let's say we target the ruler. Let's say we decrease his price. Okay, so we see his effort goes down, but the rebel's effort might go up or down, depending on strategic interaction. Now, this is what is actually interesting for us. Do we see an increase or decrease in conflict outcome? So what we see here is that resources, that this is actually ambiguous, depending on which environment we play in. So the rebels react by decreasing or increasing their effort, depending on relative military strength. And that is interesting, the reduction in the price may inadvertently lead to a higher conflict intensity. Yeah? For example, here. Okay? Or more resources wasted. Here. But we also see that policies targeting the ruler are robust to state strength. So independent of state strength, yeah? So this is the same and this is the same. Independent of state strength, once we know military strength, we know what will happen once we intervene. That's the good news, if you want. Now, what about if we target the rebels? If we target the rebels, it's a bit different because then state strength also plays a role. So we know that the state is a favorite, but here, this is not enough, okay? So let's say we target the rebels, we increase their effort costs, they decrease their effort. But what happens with the state? A strong state actually realizes that now the rebels can be suppressed even easier, and he increases his effort here. Okay? This is unexpected. This is not what we would think. Oops. Okay. Okay, so basically that's what the idea what I wanted to give to you, or the message I wanted to take away is that it's important to pay attention not only to the direct effect of policies, but also to the strategic interactions that they trigger. And because then policies may have unintended consequences. Some policies are more robust than others, as we saw, so targeting the state may be more robust than targeting the rebels. So they are more robust than others with respect to state strength, military strength, as well as their interplay. And so that would be the non-marginal thing I talked about before. Changing the rules of the game may be another level for policy. That's all. Thanks.
I will discuss now the paper of Katrina. I think the paper talks about a very important subject that is very relevant, and there's not much theory about it. And the model is, at least the version I read, that was, I don't think is exactly what you presented. The model seemed very simple yet powerful to offer a number of insights. And from all the model, the thing that I like the most is that an external party, an external agent can intervene, despite the best intentions, can produce a worse outcome. And I think the model, at least the version I saw, could be extended in a number of ways, and I think you are heading into the direction that I was planning to suggest, in order to provide better advice for policymakers. And I think as an outsider, one can intervene in a number of ways, and I think you already mentioned quite a few. And the outsider can prevent a conflict, can stop a conflict, and also can to reconcile the state and the rebels. And the instruments for each of these strategies will probably be different. And some of the instruments that can be used are already mentioned in the paper, but perhaps others, we can think of others, for instance, having an international court of justice in order to redistribute the price if it's not fairly distributed, or to provide justice if there's no justice at home. And also I think the model can be adjusted to take into account the dilemma that an external party faces. You mentioned that there's lack of information, and the lack of information sometimes produces the bad outcomes. And I think as external player, sometimes you see a conflict, and what we have seen is sometimes an international player doesn't interfere and just gathers more information, and once has enough knowledge about what is the nature of the conflict, then goes and interfere. But I think that happens when there is not much intensity of conflict, or when there is no a humanitarian crisis going on. So I think you can also include the dilemma where you see an intense conflict and a humanitarian crisis, and sometimes an external party might rush in order to reduce the intensity of the conflict. And sometimes in these cases, a bad decision, a bad solution will be found because it's a rush and not properly thought through. And I think what you're trying to say is provide advice to policymakers, which is always good, but we can also play devil's advocate and think of cases where the external player doesn't have the best of interests at heart. So you can have an external player who sees in a conflict an opportunity to get rents, for instance. I can help either the state or the rebel in order to get rents, for instance, in exchange of natural resources. And probably that could be very easily derived from your model. And lastly, I think the paper is obviously all theory, but I think as a reader, it will be easier to understand the model if you provide it with some examples. For instance, you can have this outcome, and this is what Kenya witnessed, or Sierra Leone, and I think it will be a lot easier for us to understand. But I think I really like your paper. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks a lot for the comments. Yes, definitely. I mean, we're thinking about maybe taking this to the data in some way. I'm not sure yet how, but I think this is totally missing at the moment. So this is I didn't say that, but this is very much work in progress. I'm also very happy for comments. One thing that's very interesting is this idea of lack of information for third party. Of course, that is what I'm pointing at, and I think that could maybe be incorporated even more, and maybe even depending on conflict intensity or depending on the setup we're looking at. So that could be very interesting. Yes, definitely I do look at the third party that has a very, well, that wants to reduce conflict. And of course that is not always the case. I'm trying to go into that direction a bit by saying, okay, they might want to affect the distribution into one direction or the other. So they might want to help actually one party more than the other. So that's the first step I was taking in that direction. But definitely, yes, that is something that should be considered. Yeah, thanks a lot. So, are there any other questions? Yes, please.
The Torquist success function
Yes.
is really good at generating conflict and equilibrium, because the marginal return to an infinitesimal unit of fighting when the other guy isn't doing anything is really, really high. Do you think if you actually cause a conflict or a constant denominator or a scaling factor, most of your results would go through and
Okay. I mean, okay, so you're referring to the robustness with respect to constant success function, basically, right? Okay. I think, okay, first of all, I think this is, a constant success function has very, very, very nice theoretical foundations, right? So if you try to axiomatize, like to find a constant success function that fulfills certain axioms, this is the one. Other than that, I think, well, like a fixed cost or whatever, yes, of course, we would have more corner solutions. I was not talking about corner solutions. I can have corner solutions in that as well. So once a ruler is strong, I can have corner solutions. I have it in the paper. I didn't focus on that here. And that is another thing that is very interesting to this story, I think. But with respect, I think the value added is more to have this easy constant success function with easy outcomes, I think, comparing the pros and cons, I think the pros overweigh. But I think that is, open for discussion. But I'm planning to maybe make this even more general, yes. Yes. So.
Seem to assume that all rulers and all movements are the same type. How about different resource endowments, for example? How about users who want to maximize consumption versus maximize power? How about rebels who want to segregate versus control the state?
Right.
There seem to be a lot more models in the literature that are richer in terms of taking account, for example, of endowments such as oil, diamonds,
Okay.
agricultural crops, and it seems to me
Yes.
from your models you don't discuss the different types, different endowments, maybe different utility functions.
Okay, different utility functions. So these are two questions basically. So the endowment thing I can very easily answer. Basically, as long as endowments are big enough to finance the conflicts, we get exactly the same thing, right? So because I have explicit costs here, endowments would mean I have an opportunity cost. So I cannot do that. I can do that with my endowment, but that would be exactly the same result, as long as endowments are big enough. Again, if they're not big enough, we would have a corner. But there is not much difference. So with respect to endowments, that's fine. With respect to different utility functions, yes, I do assume they just maximize their income, their expected income. I do assume it's an autocratic ruler, of course, so he maximizes his income. He doesn't have to worry about re-election or anything like that. I don't know if that's what you're referring to. So, you might say, okay, he's also being worried about how others are doing because he needs to be re-elected. I don't do that, yes. That's probably something I should think about. But the endowment wouldn't make a difference in the modeling. Well, okay. I think.
If the ruler has access to unlimited budgets, right?
Okay, so you mean the ruler has access to unlimited budget whereas the rebels do not? Okay, then we would just have, of course that's a valid point, yes. But we would have basically more corner solutions, yes. So maybe I should actually do it with endowments, would be the same internal, so interior solution story, but I would have more corners. Yeah, that could be interesting. Anything else? Yes?
Sorry, just a general point of presentation, I think compliments. If you have some kind of limiting case sometimes, it's easy to say, well, it's just depending on who's strong and who's weaker, you say, well, when somebody's only one person has all the strength, what happens? So sometimes I think it's better to have
The limiting cases? Yes.
some kind of comparison to say, okay, compared to that situation, which is
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, okay. Keep that in mind. Okay, thank you very much. Do you have a microphone? Do you want one? You cannot walk around with that.
Oh, I see. No, that's okay. I'll just stand there. Yeah, I'm fine. Let's see here. Does this mean I get 5 extra minutes, or? I said, does this mean I get 5 extra minutes?
I was told I am not allowed to take into account the
Oh, I see. Okay. Well, so let me start by saying thanks for coming, and I'm going to give the usual disclaimer that this is very much work in progress, but I want you to believe me this time because this is actually the first time that we're presenting this work. This is joint work with James Fensky, who is sitting in the front there and has fearlessly organized this conference. So you can come up to him and thank him later or accost him, whatever you'd like. So let me just give you a little bit of motivation for the question that we're asking. We are interested in kind of contributing to this literature that has begun to try to understand whether parts of our preferences that we generally think of as fixed or as endowments potentially evolve endogenously depending on things that we've experienced early in life. So there's a recent paper that, for example, within the sort of case of a particular conflict, looks at the evolution of time and risk preferences. So we actually look at preferences towards political engagement and knowledge and political attitudes. And so there's actually a few other studies that have tried to do this for the cases of various conflicts in the past. And we're going to talk about basically how we try to contribute by synthesizing that literature and thinking about it a bit more generally for the case of Africa and for a nationally representative population. But needless to say, in this room, political knowledge, engagement, and attitudes matter. We know that better informed voters turn out more and vote for better candidates. We know that civic engagement builds social capital. That democracy, has been shown to be strongly associated with growth. So what we basically try to ask is, essentially, does exposure to war, in particular in early life, contribute to changes in political preferences and political engagement? And for this particular question about how preferences evolve, it's really important to try to understand, does war actually beget war? So does war change preferences to the extent that the next generation or people who are exposed in early life are more likely to be violent, or potentially, less likely, or more likely to vote or less likely to vote? And if so, if we find that these kind of negative effects of war persist for a long time, this could help in explaining part of what has been called the African growth tragedy by some people very close to here. So what we do in this paper is essentially measure for a sort of a bunch of nationally representative surveys in sub-Saharan African countries, how exposure to conflict in early life shapes political beliefs and activities. So essentially, we take data from the Afrobarometer survey in 17 sub-Saharan African countries from 2005, and we merge that data with data on the spatial and sort of the location and intensity of wars in Africa over the last 5 decades. And overwhelmingly, our conclusion is a non-result, essentially, that exposure to conflict during early childhood seems to have very small standardized effects on later life political engagement and attitude. So, we were kind of surprised by this, and for a while we said, well, maybe we should focus on something else now. But when we started sifting through this literature, I think we found that our results were consistent with some of the stuff that's been done before, and I think consistent with some of our ideas about how preferences evolve and how individuals respond to war, drawing from literatures outside economics, from psychology and anthropology. So we thought, we should stick with the idea anyway. So let me tell you what we found in detail, and I'd love to hear, your comments on our approach and our results. So, of course, what we try to do is to show that this non-result is robust to various alternative specifications, to measurements, data sources, other possible data problems, and where this kind of idea fits into the literature. And the implications broadly that we draw are, one, that individuals are, at least on average, when you look at national representative data, resilient. And I think this is something that fits in quite well with the literature that I mentioned from psychology and anthropology, but might seem surprising given that, we think that if you were exposed to conflict, that indeed we might expect your preferences and other aspects of your life and your welfare to change. And actually, if you look at a lot of the literature by some of the people in this room have shown that exposure to violence in early life does have impacts on things like the economic welfare of households or on health, but at least we think for the case of political preferences that this doesn't seem to be the case. And, just to, in a way, draw a contrast to the previous work, we basically find that population level estimates tell a different story than the case studies that focus on directly affected individuals. Okay, so let me tell you about our data and our strategy. Our data are basically on so two types of data. The first is on, as I mentioned, war location and intensity, and the second is on political attitudes and behaviors. So let me describe the war data first. So we're using data from three essentially UCDP and PRIO data sets, which geocode all deadly conflicts in Africa since 1947 and give the number of battle deaths and the spatial extent of that conflict. So we know, where a particular, say, civil war essentially originated, where the center of that war was, and then how, geographically or spatially extensive it was. So what areas it covered, and of course, unfortunately, one the issue with this is that we just have a radius essentially, so we have a kind of a circle around that center point, and we know how many battle deaths were reported in that area. And so actually, I'm going to get back to some of these issues, which I think a lot of the work that focuses on the impacts of conflict, deals with in various ways. So our kind of main specification treats battle deaths as a measure of intensity of conflict. So essentially, you're treated in our sort of Afrobarometer sample if you fall inside the radius of this conflict and are in the particular, ages, so you were exposed to that conflict between, the ages of 0 and 14, essentially. And so we're going to talk about basically different ways to define this conflict measure in a little bit, and I think that this kind of gets to our understanding of the literature more broadly that looks at the impacts of conflict. That I think there are a lot of competing and sometimes complementary and sometimes substitutable definitions of conflict, and we try to sort of be as broad as possible when we're thinking about how to measure these impacts. Okay. So just to give you some summary statistics, if we look at battle deaths in thousands, if you just add these up across all the years from 0 to 14, for the average individual in these 18 countries, you basically find that the mean is fairly large, so 26,000 deaths essentially experienced between the ages of 0 and 14. But of course, there's a lot of zeros in there and a lot of very intense conflicts. If you look at whether or not an individual experienced any violent conflict during that early period of life, we find that more than half the sample has experienced or has been essentially treated as we defined it in the first 15 years of their lives. Years of conflict exposure, again, is fairly high. It's about 4 years of conflict exposure in this nationally representative data. So, of course, this reflects the fact that there were a lot of conflicts in the last 5 decades in Africa. In addition to the PRIO measures, we also use some other measures, so from the MEPV, and these measures actually, there are scores from usually from 0 to 3, which essentially kind of catalog the different types of conflict that could be faced by the individual. And so we use these measures as well, and we actually find that they're very highly correlated, as one might expect, with the PRIO data. Okay, so let me just give you a quick example. So this, if you look at this map of Africa, you see the 18 countries that were in our sample, and each dot is essentially a respondent in the Afrobarometer survey. And so basically the way this data is coded, and this is James' mapping skill, so I can't take any credit, but basically the red spots essentially you see in the data are places where the individual experienced battle deaths or experienced violent conflict, and the blue spots are places where the individual did not. Just to think a bit about, we do this for a variety of sort of examples in the paper, and we find that it's pretty consistent with what we'd think. So, for example, for people who were born in Nigeria in 1965, when we look at them in 2005, those red spots are basically the ones who faced violence, which kind of corresponds really well with the onset of the Nigerian Civil War in the late 60s. If you look at in 1975, you basically after the Civil War was over, you see that basically almost all the sample did not experience a war during that time period. So a bunch of other examples kind of confirm to us that the PRIO data, kind of track pretty broadly, pretty well the extent of conflict in Africa over the last few decades. The second kind of source of data that we use is on political outcomes. So we use kind of engagement and attitude responses from the 2005 round of the Afrobarometer. So this survey basically covers about 25,000 individuals from 18 nationally representative surveys of sub-Saharan African countries. And we essentially do something which is not often done in this literature, is basically to, instead of looking at one outcome or another and focusing on it, we essentially look at all the outcomes, okay? So we basically look at a vast majority of the questions asked in this survey and group the questions with the help of the survey, and looking at the groups that are formed within the survey itself, but also, our own sort of common sense about where the outcomes should be going into these 10 buckets of questions. So we basically look at kind of 10 important categories of political attitudes and behavior. So some of these things have been looked at before in the case studies that I've mentioned, various places. So if we look at, for example, voting or collective action, contact with political figures, support for democracy, interest in politics, trust, support for equality, etc. So we look at a kind of a really broad way of measuring basically people's engagement in politics and their beliefs and attitudes towards politics in their country. Okay, so what we do with these data essentially is after putting, here let me give you just two examples of questions. The first question is essentially an example of, kind of attitudes about voting. So, the question asks, which of the following statements is closest to your view, A or B? All people should be permitted to vote, even if they do not fully understand all the issues in an election. And B, only those who are sufficiently well educated should be allowed to choose their leaders. Okay? And so there's a lot of these kind of A or B choice questions, which we basically kind of organize into, things that we think are preferable, things that we think are not preferable. And then we essentially take all these questions, we demean them, and we add them all together within a bucket. So if we look at, preference for equality, we have a whole bunch of these A or B type comparisons. We demean them and we add them all together. We divide by their standard deviation. We get a normalized coefficient, so we can do mean effects analysis on these variables. The reason why I'm going to tedious detail here in our construction of variables is that one of the big kind of challenges in kind of thinking about the various outcomes that have been discussed, actually the paper that was presented first was a really good example of this, where there are kind of interesting results which kind of go both ways. Some of them we think of as positive, some of them we think of as negative impacts of exposure to violence. So it's really important to understand in each of these cases and across conflicts or across different measures of the treatment intensity, what does this mean? Sort of how big are these impacts compared to one another? So we try to basically standardize our analysis to be able to report standardized coefficients and then compare these to standardized coefficients in the rest of the literature. So we were able to say basically how big are the impacts that we're seeing in terms of standard deviations. Okay, so when we do this, we come up with these following categorical variables that we're going to be using. These are the 10 kind of variables in our analysis. Okay, so our basic specification is to regress one of these kind of mean effect measures on our exposure measure, which is essentially exposure to war in these early ages, and we define that in a variety of ways. And then we control for the individual's age using age dummies and region dummies and a variety of other controls. Okay, so here's what we find. As I said before, overwhelmingly, if we look across these 10 categories of results and we look on the first column, you'll basically see that each row essentially uses a different measure of intensity of conflict. So in the first, we use battle debts. We normalize battle debts in a variety of ways. We use an exposure dummy. We use years of exposure, etc. And when we look at all these normalized coefficients, so each one of these is a standardized, is a mean effects analysis, so it's a standardized coefficient.
we essentially find very, very small effects. So for 1 standard deviation increase in conflict, we find, for example, the biggest number here, I think, is, a 0.05 standard deviation decrease in the propensity to vote. Okay, so very, very small effects. If you look, this is across actually all the 10 things that we use. Obviously, we see a lot of stars here, so lots of pretty precisely estimated zeros, but in general, we, I think these are very, very tiny effects when you look at the rest of when we're thinking about the impacts of war. If you look at things, for the impacts of war on health, for example, you see much larger impacts on standard deviations in some studies. Okay, so with my, let me see, 5 minutes, 3 minutes remaining, I'm going to zip through some of these results. Part of what we do is essentially look for heterogeneity in this response, because these are impacts on average that I've just showed you. But we might think, for example, is that as you get farther away from a conflict, that this impact on your preferences changes, or that if you're the minority in a particular place, that you might have experienced a larger impact. And generally, we actually find support that there is quite a lot of heterogeneity across these treatment effects. But in general, we find that even with the largest sized kind of subgroup analyses that we can construct, even these impacts are very, very small. Okay, so let me just zip ahead and won't show you these results. You can read them as bedtime reading. So we spent a good bit of the paper kind of trying to think about why this might be. The first thing that comes to every economist's mind is that you did it wrong. So we try to show you that we tried to do it as not wrongly as possible. So we look at a variety of different types of robustness checks related to measurement error, to migration, to specification errors, to errors in the data. And generally we find very small zeros that are in pretty tight confidence intervals around 0 as well for all these outcomes in a variety of different specifications. So as I mentioned before, this finding, it turns out, is actually not that much out of line with the rest of the literature. So we've just put a few of the kind of important studies here, but we will add to this list as the studies become known to us and come out. Actually, if you look across the last column of this table, you notice that all the standardized effects that we can calculate are fairly small. The only exceptions are the work by Blattman and Anand that basically look at the impacts of having been a child soldier, basically drafted into, conscripted into violence, and one might imagine that those impacts are slightly larger because the treatment intensity is very large. So actually these effects that we find are not so out of line with the rest of the literature. And as I mentioned before, there's some good evidence emerging that societies recover quickly after violence, both on in economic terms as well as we're showing in psychological terms. And this is actually consistent with a lot of the anthropology and psychology literature as well. So I guess the main point what I'll leave you with my sort of 15 seconds remaining is that I think when we look across all these studies that are starting to think about how political preferences evolve, we should be thinking about how to compare these effects more generally by standardizing, so that we can actually say, in a particular conflict compared to another, do we actually see larger impacts? Or for a different type of treatment intensity, do we see larger impacts? Or if we look at particular measures of preferences or political participation, do we see larger impacts? I think those things will make for interesting work, and I hope that we can contribute to that. So thank you very much. I look forward to your comments.
Okay, I'm discussing this paper. So I had the same problem. I read it. I thought it was very interesting, and then I thought, why is it like that? And that's really weird. So basically, my comments are going in that direction. So one thing I don't really understand is why you put so much emphasis on this non-result. So basically, okay, you have a small result, but you don't have a non-result. I think because so one thing I thought strange from the beginning is that you put all conflicts in one thing, in one, you know, basically you do not distinguish between, for example, an international war and a civil war. And then you have, you do this at some point, and then you have these ethnic wars, and then, but then you actually find, because I would think ethnic wars have more influence on attitude, whereas an international war, maybe where they try to target only strategic objects or whatever, maybe has less impact. And you actually do find that, right? You find that with ethnic, so if you only look at ethnic wars, you find more impact. So I think maybe, I was just wondering why you concentrate so much on that non-result result. That would be one thing. The other thing is, you don't take into account the years after the age of 14 that they have been exposed to war, I think, right? So that seems a bit weird, because let's say there was a war for 10 years, and then somebody was 14 when it started, and somebody was 2, and then the 14-year-old has only been exposed for 1 year. Actually has been exposed for more, and the 2-year-old has been exposed for 10 years. So I don't know, maybe some discussion on that would be interesting. Another thing, one of your conclusions is that you should not concentrate your international efforts on a broad part of the population, which I thought was a bit weird, because do you control for actions or for international actions that have actually been taken in these conflicts? Because that's something, I mean, you need to control for that, right, in order to say that actually they don't really matter. And I didn't see that in the regressions. Okay, just one final, I have some more comments, but one final thing, maybe, I was wondering if you thought about multicollinearity issues in general. So for example, you know, you control for region, and I would think that region maybe picks up a lot of what you actually want to capture, and maybe that's why the effects are so quantitatively small. You know what I mean? Like, so that just the region dummy, basically, most of the attitude thing is then covered in the region dummy, and then you don't find it in that, but it's just maybe a region because it's in the region dummy because the region has been exposed to a lot of conflict. Yeah. Oh yeah. One more thing. So the sample size varies a lot in your main table, in table 2, and then your conclusion is, okay, it has an effect on that one thing, one column, let's say on voting, but not on trust. But then in trust, the sample size is much smaller. I don't think you can have this conclusion if you don't run the regression on the same sample. But just okay. Yeah, that's mostly it.
Thank you. So, how about I respond and then take other questions? Okay, so first of all, thank you for reading the paper. I appreciate it, and I'm sorry if it was, you know, first drafts are always written poorly. So I wanted to, yeah, so some really interesting issues you bring up. So why do we focus on the non-result? For example, you mentioned that, you know, we do some analyses where we look at different types of war using the MEPV data. I think that's a good question. So, I mean, even when you look at ethnic wars, for example, which are, so let me just show you that slide because I didn't get to, you know, this is cheating, but so, you know, if you look at the different types of conflict, actually, what we find is that ethnic war seems pretty strongly, you know, precisely related to different types of outcomes, but the coefficients are still very small. They're still like bounded by like 1/10 of a standard deviation. Actually, the biggest coefficients we find are for wars of independence, but unfortunately, we don't have a lot of precision when we. But these coefficients are much bigger than even the Blattman stuff. So if you look at like, you know, voting, it's almost a quarter of a standard deviation. You know, you look at this measure of deference, it's more than half a standard deviation. So actually, we do find some heterogeneity, as you mentioned, but overall, the kind of overwhelming result to us seemed like there were very small impacts overall. And I think maybe the War of Independence really is like the only one where we find an order of magnitude difference. Everything else is, you know, really bounded almost by 0.1 standard deviation. So years of exposure past age 14, that's a great question. So we actually do, you know, we actually go all the way out to age 30 when we look at this, and we find pretty similar results. And I think, this was kind of more in an effort to focus on exposure in early life, because we know from a lot of different literatures that exposure in early life, events in early life matter, and seem to matter a lot. So I think that's what we wanted to focus on, just as a matter of preference. But I think you're right that, you could go on experiencing these impacts, and perhaps you might argue that some of these outcomes might change most when you're actually involved in the process, and are exposed as an adult. Okay. So your other question, so interactional actions being controlled for, we don't actually control for them, because we're not sort of distinguishing broadly when we do these main results on types of conflict or the particular conflict, etc. But also I feel like what we want to capture is a net effect, right? We want to say net of all the possible actions that are being taken, that in almost every conflict, the Red Cross is involved, and there's humanitarian work, there's, other things that we actually probably can't measure that are going on within the country during the time of conflict. What we want to measure is essentially net of all that, is there an impact? Or rather, that's one question that we're answering. I think it's another question to say, if we exclude that, what's the effect of conflict? Yeah. Okay.
Because in your conclusions, you say we should talk about international actions. And I thought, okay, but then you need to see, because maybe these are just like that, because the conclusions are just like that, because there were international actions.
Uh-huh.
That's what I mean.
Yeah, that's actually a good point. No, I think, what we want to try to get at, I think, as a first order thing is there this kind of, on average, net of all the things that go on to try to mitigate the impacts of conflict, do we still see effects? So dummying, we actually look at a variety of different fixed effects for different types of regional and country dummies and that kind of thing. We find pretty similar results. And sample size, I have here, yes, very annoying. It is actually a problem, and I think unfortunately we don't have a lot of it. We have lots of blank answers for some of the questions, particularly trust, as you noticed. So I think you're right that that'd be great to look at the kind of a common sample, which would be unfortunately a very, much smaller than the actual sample that we can use. But yeah, that's a great point. I'll take questions. Yeah.
You asked this question in the presentation. How do you deal with the word-induced migration? So you're reserving people with them now.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, unfortunately, I think this is a big caveat, that we have to put on. What we try to do is essentially, oops, let me just show you that. What we try to do is, why can't I find it now? We essentially look at subsamples that we think should be less mobile, and show that the impacts on those subsamples are also kind of the same order of magnitude as the impacts across the average population. So, for example, we exclude all the large cities. We remove individuals living in regions where they're not in their, with the rest of their ethnic group. We measure war at the country level or the ethnicity level rather than the localized level, and we restrict to a rural sample. So those are the things that we can try to offer to sort of say that migration can't explain this lack of an effect. Because we should see it in some of these subpopulations if migration is really that large of a contributor to biasing this thing to zero. Doesn't look like that's the case, but I think we still have to put a big asterisk next to that. Yeah.
So following up on this age question, the 0 to 14, so a slightly different point than what you're saying is that part one was that if you're 2, you get 10 years. You're 14, you only get 1. But what I was thinking is sort of, can you say something about sort of the mechanisms? So like on the literature on war impacts on child health or on education, there's sort of a direct effect on that kid's health by exposure. But here you're talking about a kid's opinions about voting or a child's preferences about democracy. And it's not really clear why an impact from 0 to 5 and 0 to 10 should affect their preferences later, right? And I can see a much stronger argument for, an exposure at 18 or 20 or 20 to 30, or saying they're exposed to something that changes their views about how government functions or how society works, and that's really where the
action might be. Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. I mean, we have actually looked at all sort of like 5-year age groups from 0 to 30. We actually don't find big impacts on any of the groups up there, and yeah. So I think you're right that we might expect for some of these outcomes that you might form your preferences, and your preferences might be most malleable as an adult rather than a child. Yeah. Yeah.
Switching between categories is more successful conflicts when you get recategorized into different centers. So if you then start to place more emphasis on interpretation of the
Right. Oh, that's a great point. Yeah. Yeah. So for the second thing, I think that's a great point. We should try to do that actually based on success. So we can go through conflict by conflict and think about who won and who lost. The first point about peer effects, I think you're right, and actually, I think that'd make a fascinating study. Think about how proliferation of these preferences takes place. I think I think you're right that as our fixed effect gets smaller, spatially, that would be potentially more of a concern. And I think we generally, even if we use country fixed effects, say, we generally find the same, sized coefficients. So I think if that's operating, it's at least an order of magnitude smaller than the coefficients that we find. Yeah. Yeah.
Just to think about how small is small. I really struggle to interpret standard deviations of an index. But what would be interesting is to find something else, say between ethnic groups, something that the median index jumps like high. So in standard deviations, you say, well, conflict, it's far less than something with it.
Right.
It gives some kind of magnitude of what really is small.
Yeah.
And the second thing is relating it from battle deaths to change norms and values. Of course, the heterogeneous effects could just be because battles have different degrees of civilian organization, right? So by finding a small effect doesn't necessarily mean you find a small effect of civilians are visually affected by violence on norms and values.
That we're individually affected.
No,
Yeah.
because
Right. This is kind of a population level.
Actually, some of these conflicts have less civilian victimization, therefore the low effects on these this other kind of conflict, something that's more civilian, and that's why.
Right. Yeah, no, I think that's right. I mean, so we're trying to interpret everything at the population level. So I think that these are impacts at the population level, and that's I think why you'd see differences potentially in when you're say comparing a different type of estimate, say like looking at people who have been exposed for different periods of time, but all who have been exposed to an intense war, like some of the case study examples that I mentioned do. But I think so I think there are two different questions. It's interesting to know on the population level, what do we see in a national representative sample? What happens when you are exposed to conflict? So, and your first question about how small is small, I mean, that's something that I'm still struggling with, and I don't know, that's a great question. I don't really know. I know there's impacts of ethnic fractionalization, for example, that have been, that are also standardized, and we can kind of compare our estimates to those on political preferences and that kind of thing. But
something that we all know is obvious.
And must have a large impact, yeah. Because you're right. I mean, maybe this is like how small is small is really asking what do we expect the size of this impact to be. So maybe, I mean, it'd be I think interesting to compare one on the dimension of the impacts of conflict on other things like on health or on economic well-being. We know that some of those standardized coefficients are a little larger, but I don't know, maybe they should be larger because you don't have enough to eat when you're at war. So anyway, but that's a good question. It's more philosophy than I'm used to. So well, all right, I'm getting the signal, I think. So thank you very much. I really appreciate all the comments.
Can you hear me on this mic? Yes, excellent. All right, thanks a lot, and Katerina will keep me honest on time. Okay, so this is a joint paper together with Bilal Siddiqui, who is here in the audience as well, who is also responsible for any errors. This is, delivering justice to the poor is the topic, theory and experimental evidence from Liberia. This is a paper really about form shopping and legal pluralism, but that seemed too technical a title. We're interested in programs and reforms that attempt to improve access to justice for the poor, and we think that these programs have to confront a kind of prima facie challenge, which is the fact that for all of our reforms to extend access to formal credit markets and land titling, and I have other projects on these topics, we have a basic fact that most poor people don't use the formal sector to resolve their land disputes or for their marriages or for their credit transactions and so on. That they choose, we're going to argue, they make constrained choices to take these disputes to customary institutions and not the formal law. As an economist, with data, this presents all kinds of problems. The things that you see as disputes kind of are endogenously selected because they fit in a given forum. And so we want to overcome this both with a randomized trial, but also with thinking kind of systematically about the choices people make about forms and why they choose what they choose. All right, so since I have far too much for my 15 minutes, let's get it all on the table in one slide first. So summary, our basic thesis here is that the poor face a trade-off. They trade off the customary system's efficiency at redistributing resources versus the formal system's content. That there are groups, women in many cases, refugees, ethnic minorities who have greater rights under the formal law, but they may face more efficient remedies and recourse under the custom. So we develop a little fairly gimmicky for the theorists in the room model of this, have predictions about what demographic groups should go where, and then we have survey data on 4,500 disputes in rural Liberia to sort of test our model. If you believe our model and our test, the outcome is going to be, well, we need a solution, we need a new option that overcomes this trade-off. And what do you know? We have an intervention to show you. Legal aid from mobile paralegals who are trained in the formal law, the norms and the rights under formal law, but they kind of bring these norms and rights into the trappings of the customary law. And they go out into the villages to deliver formal justice in the trappings of the customary law. So the second half of the paper basically tests this intervention. We have a randomized impact evaluation, and we find, with individual randomization of just a smaller sample of 420 cases, well, in line with the model, we get high take-up, particularly from disputants who would have otherwise gone to the formal sector, but also who otherwise would have gone nowhere. So disputes that you wouldn't have seen in any system suddenly emerge. And we find not only impacts on the case outcomes, the reports of who won, what they got out of the case, but downstream benefits in terms of economic outcomes and household welfare that we can measure as well. All right, so begin with our little model. Our model, I'm not going to show you in much detail, but let me try to give you the intuition. There are basically two assumptions that drive most of the model. The first is that the custom is biased against these certain social demographic groups. Biased relative to what? I don't want to get into a normative game of which is better. We're just going to define whatever the formal sector would do as the truth or the median or what have you, and we're going to say that the custom deviates from that systematically for some demographic groups. And the second assumption is that formal justice is leaky, in the sense of kind of leaky bucket redistribution, when formal judges try to impose a remedy and say, you stole from him, so I'm going to give that back to you. Well, think about what they do. Criminal versus civil law really kind of highlights this distinction. In many cases, if it's a criminal case, they're going to focus on punishing the guilty party, as opposed to treating this as a civil case and trying to redistribute wealth and utility. So formal remedies lose some of that utility. There's a net loss there. They're more punitive than restorative in the language that other disciplines might use here. All right, our setup here is that the first move is made by who is going to eventually be the defendant. They choose whether or not to inflict harm on the plaintiff. If a plaintiff is harmed, they have three choices. They can do nothing and just sit on this and accept the harm. They can take this case to the customary sector, or they can take this case to a formal court or the police and so on. That brings us to the last stage, which is we've got two sets of judges. We've got a chief or our customary judge who can assign a remedy, and a remedy is just redistributing utility from the defendant back to the plaintiff. And this should really be kind of a continuum of remedies, but we didn't know how to draw continuous choice sets in LaTeX, so you get binary things. And the formal judge as well can either choose low remedies or high remedies. All right. So we can solve out and come up with some predictions, but before we go to that, let me just talk about how this maps onto our data. So we've got survey data of just over 2,000 households, and these 2,000 households report over 4,500 disputes. Now, you're going to say, well, what's a dispute? And we're going to say, exactly. We don't want to impose ex ante a definition of what a dispute is. We're going to see what kinds of disputes and what kinds of people take these disputes to different places. So some of these are murders, and some of these are marital disagreements. This runs the gamut here. Overall, we get a majority, nearly 60% go nowhere, 38% go to the customary, and this tiny fraction of 4% go to a formal legal institution. And then we can observe, we used a binary variable, did the judge impose any actual penalty? And we have these measures. We're going to focus on these. We've got a set of measures of how satisfied were you with the outcome, were you respected in this forum, would you go back there, and so on. And we haven't normalized these. This is this Likert scale that's 1, 2, 4, I think. This is like, yeah, sorry. These need to be normalized for you to be able to, the standard deviation is like 1.5. We need to normalize these figures. All right, we'll come back to the data, but let's look at some of the predictions. So the first half of what I'm going to do is going to be talking about testing these predictions with observational data, our baseline survey data, and then we'll talk about the RCT results. So running through these very briefly, I'm short on time, so I'm not going to show you everything, but we have predictions about dispute types. Plaintiffs are more likely to report the dispute to any forum, and especially to the formal, if there's a lot of harm. So if you look at the proportion of cases that go to the formal sector, you see the most likely to go to the formal sector, more than 25% of murders go to the formal sector. Murders, you might also think that disputes which are less frequent are the ones that is a really crude proxy for how severe the dispute is. Murders are infrequent and they go to the formal sector, as our little form shopping model would predict. At the other end, somebody owes me money. That's really common and really unlikely to go to the formal sector. Ceteris paribus, we predict that disadvantaged plaintiffs, basically people who are poorer and have less resources to afford the costly formal sector, are more likely to go to the customary. But when we measure these plaintiff-defendant pairings, plaintiffs facing greater bias, which we call beta, women suing men, for instance, will either not report or will go to the formal system, or are more likely in the data to do so. And we run our multinomial logit of forum choice, and just to talk, point to a couple of things, it works probably best in the case of our gender variables in the formal sector. Men are more likely, all other things being equal, to go to the formal sector. That's the male dummy here. But gender bias, women suing men, if you have a male-female pairing, are also more likely to go to the formal sector. So it's kind of complex. We interpret the levels and the interaction in two different ways. The payoffs, the customary system provides greater aggregate welfare. The sum of the utilities of the plaintiff and defendant are higher. So this is this outcome variable, this, these satisfaction with the outcome, this subjective satisfaction with your case. We have both plaintiffs and defendants. The first column just says, there's an average of 0.43 satisfaction, whatever that means for plaintiffs. But a plaintiff in the formal sector is slightly less satisfied. It's insignificant. A defendant in the formal sector is much, much less happy. So this kind of corresponds to our caricatured understanding that, on the margin, plaintiffs are the ones doing form shopping in our model. They always choose the best place to go for them. But defendants who end up in the punitive formal system are much less happy about it. And we can interact that then with these various measures of bias, women suing men, and so on, and get the signs that we would expect. All right, all this by way of motivation to get to what we are working up to, which is our legal aid intervention, or experimental evaluation. So if you believe our form shopping model and that people face this trade-off, we want basically a new form that overcomes the trade-off by providing the formal law with the cost advantages of the custom. So the intervention here is going to be mobile paralegals who ride out on motorcycles to remote villages, provide free legal aid, and the evaluation starts in the summer of 2011. A new round of awareness raising, basically advertising for the program in 76 villages, brings in 420 new potential clients, and then those are randomized into treatment and control clients. So individual level randomization. We follow this panel of people for 3 months. So these are really short-term impacts. All right, so the way we think about adding legal aid to the game, it could be a couple of ways. But probably the simplest way to explain it is imagine now that there is a fourth choice for the plaintiff. They can do nothing, they can do customary, they can do formal, or they can choose to go to the paralegal who both gives them no bias, gives them all the rights of the formal law, and gives them low cost and low leakiness and great efficiency. All right, so take up, we should see a disproportionate share of disputes taken to paralegals, which would, absent legal aid, not have been taken to any form. So we have kind of a tricky way of showing this. On the left-hand side is the distribution. We already talked about that in the red numbers on the game tree. The distribution of where cases go in the baseline data. And this is our control group from the RCT. People who had 4 choices, chose the paralegal, but then were turned away. And then we get to see, okay, what did they do instead? Then they had to go back to a set of 3 things, and what did they choose? Well, disproportionately, they were definitely drawn from people that were going to go to the formal sector anyway. Second to that, in a multinomial logit context, what we find, we get actually, it's a positive coefficient on none. It's kind of hard to explain here, but we're disproportionately taking away from the customary, less so from none. And it's really coming out of the formal sector is where these people come from. All right, our other predictions for the RCT are fairly simple. Legal aid will increase plaintiffs' payoffs. That's unexciting, but probably it's unexciting from a theoretical point of view, but exciting from our impact evaluation point of view. We've got this is the point estimate and then the 90% confidence interval on our treatment effects, our simple treatment effect estimates here. We've grouped the outcomes into 5 groups. Case results, was it fair? Are you satisfied? Are you better off? You're getting significant effects kind of mostly across the board there. That's maybe less surprising. When it comes to norms about the justice system, we don't see any increase in preference for the formal law. What you do see is that people are happier with the dualistic system when they've now gotten help managing the dualistic system. We don't see big changes in general attitudes of trust. This is general trust, general happiness. Norms about gender-based violence are not changing. People are not getting land titles or demarcating new land. They're not doing more economic activity in terms of lending. What they are getting, and this is what drives most of our welfare results, there is a big increase in terms of cash payments for the resolution of family disputes. There's a lot more child support happening. This is a right under formal law that doesn't exist under the custom. People are coming to force their delinquent husbands and boyfriends to care for their children. We're picking this up in terms of measures of household food security and child food security, positive and significant effects there from the legal aid intervention. Our last kind of theoretical prediction is that these effects should be bigger for disadvantaged plaintiffs, women and minorities and so on. Those same 5 categories interacted with these demographic things. Our heterogeneous effects work basically kind of sort of for interactions with women. Women are getting more out of the program than our other clients. We're not getting a lot, you're not seeing a lot of stars for our other demographic groups really. So a little bit weak there, but some evidence that women get a disproportionate benefit from the program, as our little model predicts. All right, so returning to the summary, like I said, we think people face these trade-offs. We think we can provide a form of legal aid that helps them overcome these trade-offs and the best of both worlds in terms of equal rights and more efficient remedies. And the headline result for us is that from introducing just legal aid that focuses on the rules of the game, we can measure the economic welfare benefits from the households in the program. I'll stop there.
All right. Well, so first of all, I want to say this was a fascinating paper to read and a fantastic intervention. I think that it was kind of couched really well in your model, and I think that the results you find are really, really encouraging. So I'm going to start from that point, and then I have a few kind of questions related to the intervention itself and how you're thinking about it, and I hope that they can improve the paper. So first of all, let me start with, I would be curious to know how, just more about the formal justice system in Liberia. How fair is the formal justice system? Are the same people that are favored in the customary law also favored end up being favored in the formal courts? How big of a gap really is it? I know in the paper you talk a lot about how customary law decisions are made and how often there's a lot of social pressure to accept decisions as fair, and that pressure kind of favors the elites. Do you find that same idea through different mechanisms in the formal courts, for example, through bribery, etc.? Okay, so about the dispute, I think I think you put it really well when you say, what exactly do you mean by dispute? And I say exactly. So I think it would be really useful, and maybe you mentioned this in the paper, I didn't see it, but what's the exact question determining whether the person had a dispute in the survey? And I think that would be really important to think about what sample you're dealing with and how we expect that sample to react. I also think it's really important when we're thinking about the paralegal intervention had huge impacts on a variety of types of household outcomes that went much further than just the case outcomes. And I think it'd be really interesting to see whether this also changes people's proclivity or propensity to report disputes in the first place, or to call something a dispute. Okay, so you mentioned in the model that kind of we think of the intervention as kind of a fourth choice for people. I was kind of confused by that. I thought that what the paralegal essentially does is essentially reduce the costs of dealing with the formal sector. So there are all these fees involved, and you talk a lot about that in the paper. So dealing with the paralegal, helping to navigate through that system, changes the cost, but doesn't necessarily change the fairness, the inherent fairness of the system, right? Or maybe it does, and having the paralegal there actually changes the decision, the way the decision is made as well. So I don't know, but I think I'd be interested to hear more about that. Okay. On the household well-being results, I found these really fascinating. The first thing I want to say is it'd be really interesting to me to do a cost effectiveness type of analysis, because the impacts on, for example, food insecurity are huge, and seem to me almost to be larger than some of the interventions that actually target food insecurity. So, I wonder whether if this is all coming through huge, cash disbursements as a result of winning more of the cases. I think that tells us something about how effective the intervention is. So just comparing cost effectiveness to things that actually target those, aspects of household well-being would be really interesting. The second thing is, I'd be interested to know whether this change, the extent of these results is coming from, one particular type of dispute that's very cash heavy, or, basically what kind of dispute is driving the result. Okay, I have a few more, and then I'll let you respond. One is about spillovers, across treatment and control. I mean, I think since most disputes are local, and you're treating some of the people who want help and not treating others, do you find that people who are in your control group are are opposed to people in the treatment? Because that would obviously exacerbate that would cause you to overestimate the impact of the intervention. I thought so just one more thing related to the case outcomes. So I wonder if there's a more objective way to think about the case outcomes. I think that's, the first order outcome is, did it help you in the case or dealing with the legal system? Is there a more objective way to think about this in terms of delays to the trial, or which judge is selected, or just the outcome in terms of, did you win or did you lose, rather than the self-reported, measures that you focus on. And I think, for heterogeneity's sake, I don't know if you have enough power to do this, but you might, since it's individual randomization. Does paralegal quality matter? So where the paralegals match to people randomly, and so when we try to think about, external validity and replicating this intervention, is it a few star paralegals who are, really just generating these changes because they're really motivated, or is it that just having the paralegal there matters, not the actual quality of the person? So I'll leave it at that. Thank you. It was great.
I won't do justice to those questions because I'm curious to let others chime in, but thank you for those. That's a long list for us to go away and work through. Formal system on Liberia, how fair? Yeah, we're in the weird position of pretending that the formal justice system in Liberia, is perfect and is the ideal outcome and everything goes well if you could just get to the magistrate's court. I think that's, I'm not going to go that far, but we can point to certain areas of law, especially around gender norms and gender violence, statutory rape and things, where there are norms in the formal law that do diverge significantly from the customary law. But your comment is a point that we need to have a quicker answer for. The specific question phrasing, I won't go into it here. It's a complex answer, but yes, we should be more transparent in the paper. Let me just cherry pick a couple of things. I think there's probably a disagreement on the authorial team about whether paralegals are best described as a fourth form or as reduction in the phi and the costs of the formal form. I think the theoretical, the modeling outcome is the same either way, but it's a very different way conceptually to wrap your head around it. Certainly, people do take cases to the paralegal, and the paralegal does sometimes then walk with them to the chief or to the police station. So it's not that form shopping is done at that point. And again, one to your point, you could measure the treatment effect conditional on where you go. Is changing outcomes conditional on where you go, or is it just helping steer you to the right place? That would be really interesting. On the cost-benefit analysis of this, that's an interesting thought. I think, given the caseload and the cost of these paralegals, I'm not quite ready to say that we have the cost-effective solution to hunger in rural Liberia. I don't think the numbers would work out too well in a CBA, but we'll definitely go away and work on that. Since we're running low on time, though, other questions? Let's one here in the purple.
I had two. I'm going to reduce it to one question. Were most of the paralegals women? And did you notice any? Were you able to look at whether, especially since child subsidies or child care seems to be driving here, or seems to be a major player here, was there more success, or were more women coming to the paralegal because the paralegal was a woman?
Quick answer. Some, but not all, were women, so that is, there's variation there to answer that question, and that's an interesting thought, and I don't know the answer to that.
I didn't understand the alternative that you offered. I mean, in the observational study, you showed that there are 4,500 disputes, and 58%, if I'm right, nobody takes any action. Do you offer the paralegal alternative only those 58%, or also do the ones who already having their case before the tribunal?
Good question, and I went through probably too quickly on the experimental setup. So, for For the individual randomization, the NGO, which provides the paralegal services, comes to your village, says we have this program, we invite you to bring your cases to us, but they don't need to be cases that are currently before the chief or the courts. They can be grievances you've been quietly nursing, in your home. They can be unreported things. So these, in principle, they should be drawn from that full distribution of things that went nowhere, customary or formal. And they are, as we saw, the things that did come to paralegal tend to be more serious crimes and more formal sector-like disputes. But there are, there are many intra-household disputes around allocation of resources within the household that come to the paralegals. Yeah.
I have a question about sort of the choice between new paralegal and the old, say, the chief arbitrator, and whether the new paralegal might give you a bigger one-time payoff because he's fair, but the old chief might be less likely to get the right decision, but it will stick. So, and because the normal paralegal presumably has less ability to kind of change your status to claim payments against your husband. Is that something that kind of is there any greater for that intervention, or is that something that might be able to be teased out of the data?
I guess it's a good thing to use in a grant proposal to motivate a follow-up survey, but whether or not these verdicts will stick, I'd be speculating. That's a good question. I don't have unless Bilal you have a more coherent answer, I don't have a good answer. A good question. All right, I think unless there's any other burning questions, we're about out of time. Thank you all to all of the presenters, discussants, and all of you for participating.